Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. My name is Bumi and I teach grammar topics. Today I'll be teaching you on a topic titled the clause. A clause is a group of words with a subject and a verb. A subject and a verb. We went to the shopping mall. The subject is we. Went is the verb. I'll give more examples. The children love dancing. The children is the subject. Love is the verb. My mom bought me a bag. My mom is the subject, bought is the verb. I'm sure from those examples, it is clear how a clause looks like. A clause has a subject and a verb. Now to the types of clauses, there are basically two types. The independent clause, known as the main clause, and the subordinate clause, also known as the dependent clause. The independent clause is called that because it can stand alone, because it makes sense by itself alone. A subordinate clause, on the other hand, is called dependent because it can't stand alone. It's a group of words. It has a subject, it has a verb, but it can't stand by itself. Now, let me go back to the independent clause. Independent clause can stand alone. It's like a man by itself that enjoys itself, its presence. So, the examples I'm going to give now are just for independent clauses. They stand alone. They make sense alone. The teachers in my school are very friendly. Period. It makes sense on its own. The animals in the zoo are not quite friendly. It makes sense on its own. The items in my house are beautiful. It makes sense on its own. Those are examples of independent clauses. Now to the subordinate clause. They don't make sense on their own. They can't stand alone. Why? Because they are dependent. Dependent means they rely on people to help them to make sense. So what the subordinate clause or the dependent clause needs is an independent clause for it to make sense. So I'll give you examples of subordinate clause. Then I'll try to give you an independent clause that can be of help, that can make it to stand. So an example of subordinate clause is so that we won't be late because we were hungry. After we left the house. Since I am the only girl. Before it began to rain. Those are examples. But you can see that for most of those, in fact, for all of the examples I gave you for subordinate or dependent clauses, they can't stand on their own. They can't just stand on their own because we were hungry. I mean, how does that make sense alone? So what happened? Because you were hungry. So what did you do? So I'm going to add an independent clause to that for it to make sense. Since the dependent is just like one-legged man, it needs to rely on the main clause to make sense. Because we were hungry is a subordinate clause that can't stand by itself. So I'll need an independent clause to add to make it to make sense. We ate the bread. Yeah, that makes sense. That's an independent clause. We ate the bread. Why? Now to the subordinate clause, because we were hungry. So we can say we ate the bread because we were hungry. Wow! I have an independent clause and a subordinate clause. Okay, so Another example. After we got home. So what happened? That's the subordinate clause. It's not making sense, even though there's a subject and there's a verb in it. After we left home. We is the subject, left is the verb. Yeah, it's a clause, but it's a subordinate clause because it's not still making sense by itself. Now I need to add an independent clause. After we left home, the subordinate. So I'm going to add an independent clause. We saw a rat on our way after we left home. So after we left home, we saw a rat on the way. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, I'm going to give another example. Before it started to rain. This time around, let me bring it first. Let the subordinate clause start my sentence. Before it started raining, I had washed my clothes. Wow, I just added an independent clause to behind or after my subordinate clause. That's possible? Yes, it is possible. Your subordinate clause can come before your independent clause. It can also come after your independent clause. So, if it is coming, if your subordinate clause that doesn't make sense on its own is coming before an independent clause, then you should put a comma before the independent clause. Before it started to rain, comma, I had washed my clothes. Yeah, amazing. So you're getting better at your grammar skills now, and I'm happy about that. Have you learned something about the main clause and the subordinate clause? Yeah, so those are the major types of clauses. The subordinate clause starts with the subordinate conjunctions. I already taught that in one of my videos. You can go back to check them. Subordinate conjunctions like before, because, since, so that, once, and all that. Check them in my previous video on types of conjunctions. And now I'm so sure that you understand the main clause and the subordinate clause and how they work. Thank you. See you next time. Bye.